Welcome to Twisted Truths, where betrayal meets brutal payback, and where the most unexpected twists expose what people are really capable of. This story isn't just shocking, it's personal. My name is Lee Bennett, and if you told me 5 years ago that my own blood would stab me in the back just to stand in a place I built brick by brick, I would have called you a liar. But here we are. I'm 39 now, but I've worked at Bennett BioCare for over 14 years, my father's company, founded in our garage back in Seattle when I was still in high school. I didn't go to parties. I didn't backpack through Europe. I was in the lab with my dad, designing formulas, packing shipments, meeting with distributors in dusty warehouses. Back then, I thought one day I'd run it all. I thought wrong. My younger brother Darren was always the charming one. The golden boy. For years younger but always treated like the heir. While I was helping Dad grow the business, Darren was racking up degrees and traveling the world. First Stanford, then a stint in biotech research overseas. He was smart. I'll never deny that. But he didn't build Bennett BioCare. I did. And yet, on the day we were supposed to announce the new CEO after Dad's semi-retirement, I stood in the boardroom, contracts in hand, a 5-year growth strategy printed and bound on the table, while Dad proudly introduced Darren as the next chief executive officer. Not me. Not the man who just closed a $200 million licensing deal with a global wellness chain. Not the guy who worked 80-hour weeks to keep the company afloat through the supply chain crisis. Not the son who skipped his honeymoon to fly to Beijing for a trade negotiation. No. It was Darren. Because, as Dad put it, he's the future. I remember that moment like a scar. The way people clapped politely. The way Darren smiled at me with that half-grateful, half-superior grin. The way my own father didn't even look at me when it was done. And I, like a fool, still shook my brother's hand. Still stood beside him while he gave his first speech as CEO. Still believed I'd be okay, as long as I kept doing the work. But the thing about betrayal? It doesn't come all at once. It's a slow knife, twisting deeper each day until you bleed silently. For the next 6 months, I became invisible. Darren held flashy meetings with external consultants while sidelining me in strategy talks. He stopped inviting me to executive roundtables. My title remained Chief Strategy Officer, but in reality, I was just a glorified advisor. Every recommendation I made, overridden. Every deal I presented, delayed or diluted. The final blow came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was in my office finalizing revisions for a major patent filing when HR walked in. Not my brother. Not even a call. Just an HR rep, and a termination letter. No severance. No explanation. Just restructuring. I remember asking, did Darren sign this? And the rep didn't even blink before sliding the paper toward me. He had. My own brother had fired me. And just like that, 14 years disappeared in a puff of corporate smoke. No farewell, no thank you, no press release. Just a cardboard box and a cold silence. I drove home that night drenched in more than just rain. It was humiliation. Rage. Loss. My wife, Camilla, opened the door and saw it on my face before I even said a word. They let me go, I told her. I expected tears. I expected her to say, let's fight this. But all she did was hug me. And whisper, we'll find a way. I didn't know it then. But the man Darren had just fired. He was about to become the one person Darren would regret ever crossing. Because I knew where all the bodies were buried. I knew how Bennett BioCare really worked. And I wasn't going to stay quiet. They didn't just fire me. They erased me. The day after I was fired, I stayed in bed until nearly noon. Not because I was tired. But because I couldn't bring myself to move. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the last boardroom meeting, every slight Darren had made against me, every ignored email and closed door. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to wake up for. Camilla tiptoed into the room with a mug of coffee and sat beside me without a word. Her silence was comforting, but it also made the pain sharper. She knew this was more than losing a job. She knew it was the collapse of everything I'd sacrificed for. "Lee," she finally said, brushing a hand against my chest, "you didn't deserve this." I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because I was ashamed. Ashamed I'd let it happen. Ashamed I hadn't seen it coming. Ashamed I'd spent years proving myself to a father who never intended to give me the throne. Later that afternoon, I drove to my father's house. I didn't even call. I just walked into the old study where he used to tinker with vitamin formulas and make handwritten ledgers of early sales. He looked up from his chair, a newspaper in hand, and raised an eyebrow. "I was wondering when you'd come." I sat across from him, hands clenched. "You knew Darren was going to fire me, didn't you?" Dad didn't flinch. "He's the CEO now, Lee. He makes the decisions." "That's not an answer." He exhaled slowly and folded his paper. "Look. Darren has a vision. Maybe it doesn't involve holding on to the past." I stared at him like he was a stranger. "The past? I gave this company 14 years. I built the damn foundation. And you stood by while your visionary son kicked me out like a dog." "I didn't stand by," he said, his voice flat. "I let him lead. No apology. No regret. Just a wall of indifference." "You always blamed me for Mom's death," I said, barely able to speak the words. "You never said it out loud, but I saw it in your eyes." Dad blinked. But he didn't deny it. "You looked at Darren and saw hope. You looked at me and saw a mistake." He finally looked away. And that was all I needed to know. I left without another word. And for the next week, I spiraled. I drank too much. Didn't shave. Barely ate. I'd get up in the middle of the night and stare at the wall of old framed certificates I hadn't taken down yet. Business Excellence. Sales Executive of the Year. Global Growth Pioneer. All meaningless now. Just relics of a man who got erased like he'd never mattered. Camilla tried everything, cooked my favorite meals, arranged play dates for our daughter Maya, left job listings on the kitchen counter. But I couldn't imagine starting over. I wasn't just mourning a career, I was mourning a stolen future. That is, until I got a call from Tony Vasquez. Tony was an old friend, VP of Regulatory Affairs at a rival nutraceutical firm. We'd worked together on an international wellness summit 2 years back. He was smart, quiet, and always 2 steps ahead of the game. "Lee," he said. "I heard what happened. Darren let you go?" I chuckled bitterly. News travels fast. "Yeah. But here's the kicker, you weren't just fired. You were scrubbed." "What?" "Scrubbed. Your name's been pulled from the Bennett BioCare site. All your authored patents are now under executive supervision. Internal memos refer to the ValueMed deal as CEO-led innovation. You've been wiped." I said nothing for several seconds. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Tony hesitated. "Because I think your brother's up to something shady. And I thought you might want to know what he's risking your legacy for." That was the moment the despair began to transform into something else. Not hope. Not yet. But a flicker of clarity. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a plan. "You didn't just erase me, Darren. You buried your own grave with me." The next morning, I met Tony at a small, discreet coffee shop just outside Bellevue. We sat in the corner booth, the kind where spies meet in movies, dim lighting, chipped mugs, and a waitress who couldn't care less who you were. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. I'm going to tell you something, Lee, and I need you to keep your pulse steady. He opened his laptop, turned it toward me, and clicked on a folder labeled, BioCare Internal, flagged. Inside were PDF scans, email threads, legal documents, and data charts. The first thing I saw made my stomach twist. It was a manufacturing report for one of Bennett BioCare's top-selling supplements, Neurovive X, a brain performance booster we'd launched 3 years ago and made millions from. Only this report had red flags all over it. Batches that failed third-party purity testing. Raw materials flagged for synthetic contamination. Internal memos advising temporary silence until risk metrics are recalibrated. Where did you get these? I asked, my throat dry. Anonymous leaked to our compliance team last week. I wasn't going to say anything, until I saw your name had been scrubbed from the Neurovive development logs. That's when I got curious. I kept reading. There was an email from a procurement director warning Darren that a new supplier out of Malaysia was providing non-FDA compliant ingredients at lower costs. Darren's reply: push through. The margins justify the risk. And then I saw it. A digital signature, mine. Only I'd never signed that supplier authorization. He forged my approval. Tony, I whispered. If this gets out, the FDA will launch a federal investigation. Tony nodded. Exactly. Which is why I'm showing you this. I think Darren's planning to shift blame onto you if things go south. I sat back, stunned. He hadn't just fired me. He was framing me as the fall guy for a looming scandal. That was the moment something snapped inside me. The grief, the humiliation, the pain, they collapsed into something sharper. Resolve. Darren didn't just want me out of Bennett BioCare. He wanted me ruined. And that was a game he should have never started. Because now, I wasn't trying to protect my reputation anymore. I was preparing to dismantle his. I spent the next 48 hours doing what Darren never imagined I'd do. I started pulling every record I had from my years at BioCare, emails, meeting notes, backups of contracts I'd drafted, timelines, supplier evaluations. I'd been meticulous over the years, part paranoia, part perfectionism. And thank God for that. Because buried in those old files were receipts, literal and figurative, proving everything Darren was now trying to hide. I had dated vendor contracts showing I rejected the Malaysian supplier Darren approved. I had R&D logs with time stamps proving I paused Neurovive X development until third-party lab results returned. I had handwritten notes from meetings where I warned our legal counsel about Darren pushing profit over safety. All of it. And then, I found the gold mine, a recorded Zoom meeting. A mandatory virtual compliance review from 7 months earlier, one I'd recorded with internal consent. Darren had spoken candidly, arrogantly, about cutting corners to beat our competition, and that legal always finds a way to bury these things. I played it back 3 times just to hear his voice say it again. Lee's too cautious. He doesn't think like a real leader. He worries about little things like consumer safety. Little things. Like not poisoning people. This wasn't just a scandal waiting to happen, it was a ticking nuclear bomb. And if Darren wanted a war, he just got one. He tried to write me out of the company, now I'm rewriting the ending. I didn't sleep much after discovering what Darren had done. My mind was wired, buzzing with rage, memory, and calculation. But it wasn't the kind of rage that burned out of control. It was ice cold. I wasn't going to fight him emotionally. I was going to destroy him surgically. I sat at my kitchen table with Camilla beside me, baby monitor humming quietly in the background, as I laid out the scope of what Darren had done. Every forged signature. Every risky supplier swap. Every internal memo. Camilla listened in silence, her face a tight mask of disbelief and fury. When I finished, she asked one question: what do you need me to do? I need to get into that building again, I said. One last time. She nodded. I started by creating an external timeline dossier, not just for legal use, but for public optics. I wasn't going to just save myself, I was going to blow open the truth. And if Darren wanted to see how much damage one obsolete brother could do, I'd let him learn the hard way. My steps were methodical. Step 1: Secure allies. I started calling people who had worked with me at Bennett BioCare for years, people who had nothing to gain from Darren's rise. The first was Sarah Lynn, our former head of product development. She had left quietly 2 months after Darren's appointment, citing personal reasons. I always suspected there was more to the story. Now I knew. Sarah met me in a private co-working space and confessed Darren had pressured her into approving a batch of Neurovivex she didn't feel confident in. When she refused, he demoted her and publicly humiliated her in a leadership meeting. She quit the next day. Then there was Mike, one of the logistics managers. He told me Darren had asked him to discreetly reassign some older shipping records to align with a new narrative, one that erased my involvement and covered up supplier changes. Mike was already job hunting. I now had 2 former insiders willing to speak up if I needed them. Step 2: Leak. Quietly. I didn't want to expose everything at once. That would have been easy for Darren to contain. So I gave Tony Vasquez select pieces, just enough to stir regulatory curiosity. Sure enough, within a week, a quiet inquiry from a food and drug safety watchdog popped up on the Bennett BioCare news tracker. It wasn't public yet, but it was real. And Darren? He had no idea I was the one who planted it. Step 3: Make him sweat. I printed one of the internal memos where Darren had forged my signature. Just one. Then I mailed it to his office, without a return address. It arrived on a Monday morning. That same afternoon, Sarah called me, laughing. He's pacing around the building like a man on fire. Pulled half the legal team into a private room. Perfect, I said. Let him wonder who's holding the matches. Step 4: Set the stage for re-entry. I needed leverage, not just legal, but corporate. The board of Bennett BioCare was still chaired by my father, but the other members were veterans, business-first types who valued numbers over bloodlines. So I scheduled a private meeting with Elaine Carter, one of the longest-serving board members and someone I'd worked closely with for years. I showed her my documentation. I showed her the video. I showed her the supply chain reports, the contaminated ingredient logs, and the forged authorizations. When I was done, she sat back in her seat and said just one thing. Lee, if you go public with this, the company won't survive. I'm not trying to sink the company, I said. I'm trying to stop my brother from dragging it down with him. She looked me in the eyes. Then what do you want? Justice, I said. And my rightful place. As I left the meeting, I felt the weight begin to shift. Darren thought he had all the power. But he forgot one thing. The only thing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose, is a man who knows where everything is buried. The next move. Expose the truth at the one place Darren couldn't control. The next board meeting. You gave me a front row seat to my own erasure, Darren. Now watch what it's like to disappear. The Bennett BioCare quarterly board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 a.m. sharp. By Thursday night, I was ready. My documents were sorted. The flash drive was loaded. My allies had confirmed their positions. And Elaine Carter, the most respected board member not named Bennett, had given me her quiet blessing to show up. Not as a guest. As a reckoning. Camilla kissed me on the cheek that morning, smoothing out the collar of my navy blazer. You don't look like a man going to war, she said softly. That's the point, I replied. They won't see it coming. When I stepped into the marble-paneled executive floor of Bennett BioCare for the first time in weeks, the reception staff froze. A few glanced at each other, unsure of what to say. One security guard, new, walked over hesitantly. Sir, do you have an appointment? I'm here for the board meeting, I said calmly. They're expecting me. Elaine met me at the elevator and walked me in personally. The looks I got from the board members were a mix of surprise and discomfort. And then Darren entered. Wearing a flawless charcoal suit, all confidence and charm, until he saw me sitting at the table beside Elaine. His jaw tensed, but he smiled thinly. Well, well. Decided to pay us a visit, big brother. I'm here on behalf of the shareholders, I said evenly. And I think they deserve the truth. His smile faltered. He knew I wasn't bluffing. Dean, our father, looked between us but said nothing. His face was blank, unreadable. He still hadn't returned my calls. The meeting began with financials, projections, and Darren's usual grandstanding about disruption and global dominance. I waited, calm, until he finished. Then I stood up. Before we close, I have something to present to the board. Darren's face flushed red. You don't work here anymore, Lee. Elaine interjected smoothly. Mr. Bennett, as acting board counsel, I approved Mr. Lee Bennett's request to present supplemental information. He has the floor. Darren tried to protest, but it was too late. I plugged in the flash drive. The screen behind me flickered to life. First, I showed the forged signature. Then, the procurement emails about the non-compliant supplier. Then, the contaminated ingredient reports Darren had buried. And finally, the recording. That Zoom call. Darren's voice filled the room. Lee's too cautious. He doesn't think like a real leader. He worries about little things like consumer safety. The silence that followed was thunderous. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One looked down at his notes, pretending not to react. But Elaine? Elaine turned to Darren and asked, "Did you authorize the use of that supplier?" Darren stammered. Those were extrapolations. We were exploring cost-saving options. And that recording, it was taken out of context. Really? I said. Because I have 20 more minutes of that call. And I'd be happy to send it to the FDA. I'm sure they'd be interested in how you define context. Now Dad spoke. Enough, he barked. Both of you. He stood slowly and looked at me. You had all this, and you didn't come to me. I did, I said. You just didn't listen. He turned to Darren, his face tightening. Is it true? Did you forge his signature? Darren didn't answer. And that was his mistake. Because silence, in a room like this, is confession. The board broke for private deliberation. I walked out, heart pounding. 20 minutes later, Elaine emerged with the board chair. Lee, she said, we've reached a decision. Effective immediately, the board is placing Darren on indefinite administrative leave pending investigation. The board is also moving to reinstate you, temporarily, as interim CEO. My breath caught. Interim? I don't want temporary, I said. I want permanent. Elaine looked me squarely in the eye. Earn it. Prove you're more than just a man with a grudge. As I walked back into the building that had exiled me, every head turned. Some in awe. Some in guilt. And a few in silent celebration. Because the man they tried to erase was now the one holding the pen. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because Darren still had one more move left to play. And I knew him too well to think he'd go down quietly. He wasn't done with me. And I wasn't ready for what came next. For a while, I thought I'd won. I was back inside Bennett BioCare. Not just as a returning son, but as interim CEO, a title that sent quiet ripples through every floor of the company. People looked at me differently. Not as the man Darren fired, but as the one who came back stronger. I'd begun cleaning house. Reassigned key departments. reconnected with overseas clients. And within 2 weeks, our legal team had reopened 3 contracts Darren had fumbled. For the first time in a long time. I slept. But victory makes you soft. And I should have known better. It happened on a Monday morning. I arrived early, around 7:30. The lights were still off in most of the building, but something felt off. My office door was open. That's when I saw the folder on my desk. Thick. Manila. No label. Inside were photos. Of me. Of Camilla. Of our daughter Maya. Me leaving the co-working space. Camilla shopping at the grocery store. Maya playing in the park. A short typed note was clipped to the last page. You think this is over? Think again. You stole my future. I'm taking yours. I froze. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. Darren. He'd gone from sabotaging me, to threatening my family. And just like that, every ounce of pride I felt from being back in that office evaporated. Because this wasn't business anymore. It was war. I called Camilla immediately. She answered with a tired, "Hey love," but I cut her off. Pack a bag. Take Maya. Go to your sister's for a few days. What? Lee, what's going on? I told her. Every word. By the end, her voice was firm. You finish this. But don't take your eyes off him. I called Sarah next, told her to meet me in conference room B in 1 hour, alone. When we sat down, I laid the photos on the table. Her face went pale. Darren did this, she whispered. Yes, I said. And I think he's about to try something bigger. What do you mean? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a copy of our R&D Vault passcodes, a list that I'd never shown anyone outside of the senior science team. They've been altered, I said. Subtly. But enough to make it look like I've been misusing proprietary data. Sarah leaned in. You think he's trying to frame you again? I don't think, I said. I know. Sarah's face hardened. Then we expose him, again. I shook my head. Not yet. He wants me to panic. I won't give him that. Instead, I'm going to let him believe he still has the upper hand. That night, I drove to a private investigator's office. A woman named Dana Corsi, recommended by Tony. I handed her the folder. The photos. The forged data logs. And one mission. I need proof Darren's behind this. I don't care how deep you have to dig. She nodded like she'd done this 1,000 times. But the part that chilled me wasn't the threat, it was what Dana found next. 3 days later, she called me into her office. Lee, she said. You need to see this. On her desk were 2 things. 1, a burner phone, registered to Darren's former assistant, purchased 6 weeks ago. 2, a transcript of messages Darren sent under a fake alias to a data broker overseas, offering access to Bennett BioCare's proprietary supplement formulas, in exchange for cash. He wasn't just threatening me. He was preparing to sell out the company. My company. And that was the moment everything reversed again. The enemy wasn't just Darren anymore. It was the man who created us both, Dad. Because the only way Darren could have gotten those R&D Vault codes, was if someone gave them to him. And that someone was the founder himself. I stared at the documents Dana gave me, emails from my father's private account, sharing archived security access files with Darren, for emergency backup. It hit me like a gut punch. He hadn't just tolerated Darren's recklessness. He'd enabled it. Protected it. Protected him. Over me. Again. For a moment, I felt like the 15-year-old version of myself all over again, standing alone in the garage lab, waiting for approval that never came. But not this time. This time, I wasn't going to beg. I was going to burn the whole rotten illusion to the ground. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. After I left Dana's office, I sat in my car for almost an hour. The documents she'd given me, copies of encrypted emails between my father and Darren, proof of access transfers, and financial logs showing offshore activity, sat like poison in the passenger seat. My father hadn't just stood by while Darren sabotaged me. He'd quietly armed him. He may not have known the full extent of Darren's plans, but he'd enabled them. Trusted the wrong son. Again. And almost handed over everything our family had built to a man who would sell it for a payout. I thought about my daughters, Maya and little Sophie. I thought about how one day, they'd ask me why I didn't fight harder. Why I let their uncle try to erase their father's legacy. I wasn't going to give them an answer laced with shame. The next board meeting was set for Monday. But I didn't wait. On Friday, I called an emergency session. I brought in Sarah, Tony, Elaine. Even Mike from logistics, who now had his own logs showing Darren had rerouted product shipments to unapproved international buyers. We presented everything. Including the email where Dad himself transferred vault access to Darren. When it was over, the boardroom sat in heavy silence. Then, Elaine stood. I moved that we strip Darren Bennett of all titles, permanently. And moved to censure Dean Bennett, pending an internal ethics review. No one objected. Not even Dad. He sat at the end of the table, motionless, pale, and tired, like a man finally staring down the wreckage of all his favoritism. When the board adjourned, I remained in the room with just him. You knew he wasn't ready, I said. You knew he was reckless. But you gave him the crown anyway. I thought, he began, his voice gravelly. I thought if I believed in him enough, he'd rise to the challenge. No, I said. You believed in the son who made you feel better about your guilt. And punished the one who reminded you of your failures. He looked up. And for once, he didn't deny it. I'm sorry, Lee. I nodded. I didn't need an apology. I needed the truth. That night, I went home to Camilla and held her longer than usual. Maya tugged at my hand and asked if we could go to the park that weekend. I said yes. I promised her I'd be there. And I meant it. Because the next chapter of my life wouldn't be about fighting ghosts anymore. It would be about building something better. In the following weeks, Darren was publicly removed from the company, stripped of his stock options, and named in an internal fraud report submitted to federal regulators. Dad quietly stepped down from the board, issuing a formal statement acknowledging leadership failures. I was unanimously voted in as permanent CEO of Bennett BioCare. But I didn't take a victory lap. Instead, I restructured the company's leadership pipeline. I created a mentorship program that identified rising talent, not based on pedigree, but performance. And I did something else. I renamed our product labs. The Mariah Bennett Innovation Wing. After Mom. The one who always told me to stay kind, even when the world went cold. I haven't spoken to Darren since. He's still out there somewhere, maybe licking his wounds, maybe blaming the world, maybe still thinking he was the victim. I don't know. But I do know this. When you try to erase someone, make sure they don't come back holding the pen. Because I did. And I wrote the ending. In the end, truth has a way of surfacing, even if it comes twisted through pain and betrayal. As one wise voice once said, sometimes your greatest enemy was once your closest ally. If this story struck a chord with you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and spread the word, because justice deserves to be heard.